Hello, 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 and welcome to the week Unspun. And this is your weekly dose of news through the lens of PR professionals. My name is Fazana Bagjuel, and I am here in London.
And I'm Doug Downs, fighting a cold here, joining you from Canada's Rocky Mountains.
And oh, darn it, our American friend, David Gallagher, is not with us today. He is
Yeah.
heading to the US as we speak. So
Yeah.
it's just going to be us duo holding the fort.
Cheers,
Now,
David.
cheers, David. And lots to get through this week. And as always, please do drop your thoughts on our comments. And at the end of the show, hopefully we'll have time to run through the comments. And three big themes today. We are going to start off with Venezuela. And then that's where the mission may be over, but the narrative fight is only just beginning. We're going to then head over to Iran, where the economy seems to be having a lot of trouble. And the real story is a fractured message from the top. Now, finally, we're going to then head back to the UK and talk about the beigeness of Keir Starmer and what quiet leadership looks like in the 24/7 attention economy with flashing lights. Doug, where do we start?
What an amazing week. We wrapped up last week. We had a heavier focus on Iran, and we closed off the show, and little did we know, so much was in planning to happen in Venezuela. It was absolutely amazing. Last Saturday morning, we all woke up to a reality that few thought was possible. Nicolas Maduro and his wife were suddenly in U.S. custody in New York. Roll the video if you have a chance here, guys. This was a lightning fast Delta Force raid in Caracas, and it caught me completely by surprise. There we go. There's the start of it. The physical mission was already over by the time we woke up Saturday, but the global communications battle was just beginning. To break down the comms here, we can very simply observe the two sides that different parties, different actors are playing out. There are those who say this is bad, and there are those who are saying this is good. In the this is good camp, the Trump administration and leaders like Argentina's Javier Milei have branded this as a surgical law enforcement operation. Now, in the US, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is the primary architect of the message. He's been leaning heavily on Maduro's 2020 narcotics indictment, telling the world, hey, we didn't invade a country. We executed a warrant on a narco-terrorist. Now, by using legal terminology like indicted criminal instead of head of state, Rubio is successfully appealing to a domestic audience that values law and order while bypassing the traditional war powers debate. Conversely, in the This Is Bad camp, it's led by a powerful alliance of international critics and Democrat leadership at home. On the global stage, Russia, China, and the UN Secretary General are framing this as international kidnapping. But the most biting PR critique is coming from the congressional Democrats like Senator Tim Kaine and, excuse me, and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. Their narrative isn't defending Maduro, it's attacking the method. They're labeling the raid a sickening return to imperial adventures and an illegal act of war carried out without congressional approval. While Marco Rubio says he executed a warrant, the Democrats are telling their audience that the administration lied to their face about seeking regime change. For them, the PR goal is to frame the White House as a rogue actor that has abandoned the rules-based order and risked a forever war for Venezuelan oil. So I always like to know how the people feel. How are Americans responding? Well, extremely split in some ways. Overall approval of the capture, right down the middle. Should the president have gotten Congress to approve first? 2/3 say yes. Here's why I think, my opinion, that these numbers show that Rubio is winning the narrative right now. The Democrats are arguing the raid was an illegal act of war. But Rubio has successfully labeled Maduro a narco-terrorist. And that's the term that's been used by both parties. And the Dems' constitutional argument makes them look like they're defending a drug kingpin right now. Rubio has trapped his opponent in a narrative where their only defense is a technicality, the Constitution, while his defense, the war on drugs, is a moral one. For the Dems to turn this around, they need to reframe the narrative. And just one additional note, Farzana, media critics like Margaret Sullivan have noted that the early coverage from CBS and ABC, they've been using Rubio's vocabulary to describe this indicted criminal, narco-terrorist. And when they're using your words, that shows you're winning, or at least have an edge in the comms battle.
Well, I mean, how do we start with just unpacking that from a PR lens? So, first of all, we are not in Kansas anymore. This is not a story of right and wrong, but more a fight for agenda control. And I think from a PR perspective, of course, the raid may be over, but the contest is really who gets to define it and what that raid was, and that sort of story that's wrapped around that's going to then preserve its place in history. Now, Rubio answers something very crucial that all PR people know is that the first story is often the strongest story. And he didn't describe it as foreign policy or military action or regime change. He described it as law enforcement. And I thought that was very clever, very classic framing, because he pulls the event into a category that Americans already emotionally understand. You know, very simple: arrest the bad guy, execute the warrant, protect the public, move on. And you win that frame early, and then you force your opponents to argue from within. And so, here's the part that I think everyone's missing is everyone's thinking about actually domestic agenda control is very much, important, obviously, to the White House. But, that's only half the battle. And so what you're having is this sort of dichotomy of perceptions. You've got, how does it play out from a domestic audience and how does it play out internationally? And so the other aspect is the international reputation. But, one thing I wanted to ask you, Doug, do they care? I mean, does it even matter? I mean, tell me, does it?
I don't think they do. I don't think America cares what the outside world thinks right now. Part of America.
So, I guess if the operation plays well, at home, and looking at the stats, it clearly shows that it does. The global story is not really about warrant being executed. It's very much America grabbing a head of state in another country. That language obviously travels fast, especially in Moscow, Beijing, sort of United Nations across the world. And then, so whilst the White House can win the domestic narrative, it can then lose globally. But again, if they don't care, they don't care. It's not an outcome that they are looking for. And because once you normalize these extraordinary actions, you make it easier for other states to copy the method and claim the justification. So everyone's obviously talking about, well, how are you going to justify it when, if China wants to, sort of assert its sort of, its sphere of influence, over sort of Taiwan and, Russia and Ukraine. And so, where is that sort of moral argument, that ethical argument, that rules-based order? And so, but again, if they don't care, they don't care. And so it's not really a debate about whether the capture was good or bad and how it plays out internally and globally, but it's also a question of, fundamentally, do they care? And when we are working in PR, you set your goals firsthand. You also set your agenda, your messaging, but also your audience. You determine your audience. And sometimes we may be shouting sort of, around the world that this is wrong. But fundamentally, if we are not the target audience, we are not relevant.
Yeah, the current administration, just to clarify what I was saying, I don't think the current administration cares all that much what the rest of the world thinks, or at least they're not putting that out there. I think the Democrats do. I think they care a great deal. If this story was in isolation, Farzana, I think it'd be fair to say that Rubio has done such an effective job for his audience that they'd be winning the day. Got a good comment from Uncle Buzz 6913. Great job, Congress. Not needed. We have a warrant for the illegal dictator. See, that is absolutely, there's a point out there that's being said. Others are saying there is a process for this, and it comes down to Article 1 and Article 2 in the Constitution, right? And those two are supposed to complement one another, and the current battle is, do they conflict at times? So, all right, the other story I know we wanted to tackle, I've been so fascinated by Iran since we started covering this last. I've been digging into, I've been doing it online. I haven't been taking like studies, but I've been looking at the history of Persia and the history of Iran to understand the protests, because we're in this media vacuum, and I'm embarrassed for my former craft how poorly the international media, the ones from whom we expect more, I'm embarrassed by how poor a job they've done. We are watching a high-stakes study in fragmented crisis communications playing out in real time in Iran. As the Iranian rial collapses, the streets are igniting, but the story is the jarring PR disconnect between the president, the supreme leader, and now a resurgent exiled opposition. And that's the key, that the opposition has come in. What started as a strike in the Grand Bazaar is now a nationwide uprising. Let's go back to the start of the video if we can, guys. This is part of the way through. What started out as a strike in the Grand Bazaar is now a nationwide uprising. The triggers are economic, at least they were at the beginning. skyrocketing prices for basics like rice and wheat. That'll push people into the streets. But the response from the top has been very split. We're actually seeing a classic good cop, bad cop routine, and it's being played out through official state rhetoric. President Masoud Pezeshkian is currently attempting a conciliatory tone. He's publicly tasked his officials to listen to what he calls the legitimate concerns of the protesters. This is a rare attempt at empathy-based crisis management. He's trying to validate the grievance to keep the government's brand from completely breaking with the public. But the bad cop has now entered the room. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has broken his silence, and he is taking a much sharper rhetorical path. He's now pivoted to a relabeling strategy. He isn't calling the people protesters. He's calling them rioters and enemy mercenaries. Now, by shifting the vocabulary from protest to riot, he is signaling to the security forces that the time for dialogue is over, time for a crackdown. This is a PR permission slip for a crackdown. Adding a third layer to this messaging war, the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi is now issuing his first direct call to action through a video message in Farsi. It's all being played out on social media, quite frankly. He's moving beyond mere support and is actively organizing coordinated protests. Crucially, he's framing a direct appeal to the regime's own security apparatus, asking them which side of history they want to stand on. By highlighting his national cooperation platform, a secure channel that he claims thousands of regime insiders are already using to defect, Pahlavi is attempting to break the regime's international communications by offering a safe harbor narrative to the very people currently holding the batons. What makes this even more complex from a comms angle is the perceived media blackout in the West. While social media has been flooded with video of the Grand Bazaar shuttering and security forces clashing with citizens, major outlets like BBC and the New York Times have been criticized for being slow. Even the comedian John Cleese has jumped into the fray on X, saying he is ashamed of the BBC's coverage. In the world of PR, when reputable news sources stay quiet during a historic event, it creates a massive information vacuum, one that is currently being filled by unverified social media reports and competing propaganda. Farzana, I spend my nights watching the hockey game on TV, looking through my phone and say, oh my God, look at the size of that protest. I can't pronounce the name of that province, but oh my God, it looks huge. And then someone in the comments says, this is from 4 years ago in Kurdistan or something like that. But that's how I spend my nights, is trying to figure out what's real and what's not from Iran, when what looks like could be another revolution is happening before our very eyes.
I mean, Iran is fascinating, and I've always been fascinated. My grandfather was actually the military advisor to the Shah of Iran, and I always sort of grew up understanding that about Persian culture. You know, I think my father learned Farsi so that he could understand the poetry. I think whilst Iran is in the news, I think it's always an opportunity to learn about cultures. And if you really want to understand sort of Iran and Iranian people, understand its sort of civilization, its history, and the best way to start actually is poetry. You've got sort of Sheikh Saadi, Rumi, and
Rumi.
You know, sort of many others, and particularly I think the golden era, sort of 13th century Persian poetry, absolutely sublime. And I do think actually understanding sort of culture and history really puts the sort of context of current affairs, and you sort of understand a little bit more about the dynamics, because a lot of people are sort of, you know, think Iran has always, you know, been this very conservative society, but actually during the Shah of Iran's time, and indeed even Afghanistan at the time, they look, you know, markedly different to how the people are sort of, you know, live today. Now, what we're seeing in Tehran is really a three-way communications war, and each actor is playing a different game. We have President Pezeshkian, who is doing classic crisis containment. He's trying to keep the government's sort of public-facing brand intact by validating the grievance, signaling empathy and dialogue, because he is speaking directly to population. So a bit of hedging his bets there. You have the Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the spiritual leader, is doing something completely different. He's not really addressing and empathizing with the public sentiment. He's instead relabeling the protesters as rioters and sort of enemy mercenaries. And so he's not looking to sort of persuade or bring them, into sort of his camp of understanding. So you've got this sort of legal and moral reclassification that he's framing, and also it's that sort of comms trigger that's really telling these security apparatus, treat this as an enemy operation with little empathy, and that's really agenda controlled through language. And why is language so important, particularly in these situations, is because you could reframe the agitators, either sort of freedom fighters or protesters as writers, or indeed the enemy. And when you start using words like enemy, what you're really doing is using words to justify state violence and force. So words are often the foot soldiers before violence that comes, in a way, sort of manufacturing consent for what is coming. So it's always quite interesting to analyze. Now, we then have the son of the Shah of Iran, and he is positioning himself as the hero of the story. The protests are, in a way, it's very classic Joseph Campbell. For those who don't know, he's a well-known architect of the hero's journey. And it really talks about how across the ages, across cultures, ultimately stories sort of underpin similar archetypes and sort of archetypes rather. And there's a certain sort of journey. And you've got the inciting incident, which is the protests. You've got the bad guy, the bad archetype, the Ayatollah Khomeini. And then you've got the classic hero's journey in play. And of course, that shifts in terms of who's a bad guy, who's a good guy, depending upon the lens that you're looking at. But I would actually have a look, for those who aren't in the know, do a bit of a Google of Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey and see how that plays up. Because actually what you see is the good cop, the bad cop, the archetypes. And you see that play out in all political theatres around the world. And it helps you, I think, understand the news and the agenda and the narrative around the news, and the framing as well. Now, then you've got to layer in the Western media dynamic. Now, major outlets are appearing somewhat slow, cautious, but you also have some practical matters. Is that it's not always that you're going to have a Tehran correspondent on the ground who's going to tell you everything that's happening. So you do have a sort of a structural issue with a lot of media reports, and you are seeing a bit of an information vacuum. And in crisis comms, when you have a vacuum, it always gets filled, and usually by a very emotionally compelling content that may not always be true. And so so that's how misinformation gains authority, because it arrives with certainty, while the responsible voices sort of arrive with hesitation. And as you can see, the BBC's taken quite the beating from John Cleese, amongst others. So Doug, yeah, that's
and so I just want to be fair to the BBC. Let me share my screen really quickly. This is
I
the
love
main
the BBC.
page.
Yeah,
Okay.
I love
main
it.
page.
I feel bad. Yeah,
front and
Yeah.
center. Front and center. Number one story is Iran. This afternoon. So I'm glad they found the cup of coffee, cup of tea, whatever it was they needed to wake up. But they have not been covering this, and it's good to see it on the front page finally. But if the Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi, and this is just me projecting, he's been living in the United States since being exiled as a teenager in the late 70s, the revolution. Obviously has connections to the US, has made multiple appearances on Fox News, which I think has connections to the current government. It would be a swing back to, remember, the former Shah was accused of being too connected to the US. It would be a potential, the whole dynamic of Iran, of the Middle East, completely changes. And I'm not smart enough to project what all that means, but my goodness, Beirut would come to life again, all that stuff. It just seems marvelous to me.
Yes, I think it's always fascinating. Of course, when a country has the sort of natural resources that Iran has,
Yes, they do.
Exactly. So I think it always complicates matters. And whoever wins the narrative war, there's always going to be an active narrative against it that's going to sort of be continuing. Now, let's go on to closer home territory, the UK. We have had a critical gaze on Prime Minister Keir Starmer. And I remember actually when he first became our Prime Minister, the New York Times ran a story, I think it was the 50 Shades of Beige. And since then, that word beige been rumbling along, and I don't know what's wrong with beige. Maybe I'm beige. I don't know. But I don't think they just mean beige as in he is beige in terms of his skin color. I
Means
think
flavorless, like lacking.
he's beige. I mean, personally, I love
Yeah.
beige. Anyway, so everyone's been, so all of a sudden that sort of narrative, that term has been propping up again. I saw it in the Spectator and a number of other sort of news outlets where they're talking about him just being a little bit too beige, a bit sort of dull. And then, of course, across the pond, you've got bombastic President Trump, and so you're beginning to think that actually, do you think that actually British politicians, they need to be a bit more performative, a bit more sort of, entertaining? Do you think charisma actually is what wins in the public sort of theatre? I mean, we had, our Prime Minister Boris Johnson, he was very charismatic. Also Nigel Farage, very charismatic. You've got sort of, Polanski, who's the leader of the Greens, again, very charismatic. And so what happens with these politicians that don't have that inbuilt charisma? Do we elect charisma? Is it very much this sort of animal instinct that we want as political leaders, as opposed to that sort of rational brain having a look at the policy? What's your thoughts, Doug, as you are looking across the pond, looking at British politics?
Looking at British politics, yeah, beige is one word, vanilla seems another. Well, for one, the UK chose beige. It was their preferred color. They didn't want, wanted lack of personality at the time,
actually,
right?
Yeah, we wanted boring, actually, after all the drama. Before, we wanted boring. And I wonder if it's useful, Doug, for you to just, we could take the temperature of what, how the Brits are feeling about Keir Starmer. Could we have a look at the polls to see? So at least you could see, because of course, yes, we all did want, we wanted somebody that was, a bit beige.
How far is he in his term? Is he 2 years in his term?
He's just, poor thing. He's just a year in, and so he's disliked 54%. It's pretty high. And so do we have anything else that we can show Doug over there? There you go. So one of the most unpopular leaders in the West.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, Macron's the only one who's beating him in terms of sort of unpopularity. So he is, he's really having some problem. Now, we do have actually a comment from our lovely Anne-Marie Blake, who says, please, as you know, vanilla is my favorite ice cream. I'm tired of the soap opera. I too, and it is, what do people want? Do they want entertainment? Or
isn't it a pendulum? Don't we swing back and forth? We want personality, we want character, in the hopes that it's similar to ours, that they are saying things that we kind of think, and therefore we're smart because the leader is saying those things. And then we get used to their personality and we're sick of them. We want to discard them. It's almost like any other relationship, right? And we want, I don't want all that personality. I'm just talking to a Canadian. I mean, Canadians, we elect beige. We go hunting for beige. We want vanilla, right? We elected a prime minister in Justin Trudeau multiple times, and then we got tired of his character. And chose the same party and elected a new leader, Mark Carney, who I think folks in the UK know very well. And I think we're finding him kind of beige. So but that's how Canada rolls.
Yeah, but maybe actually voters nowadays, we're just a glorified Netflix audience. We just want to be entertained. And when we're bored, we just want them out. And maybe we're just drama kings and queens. We just want drama. I mean, even us Brits, we're tuning into the US politics. I mean, who needs Netflix? Honestly, I mean, Netflix should just be a live stream from the White House, quite frankly. And I think, forget all the production sort of costs. Let's just live stream what is happening in the real world. So my question to you, Doug, is, do you find British politics quite dull in comparison to the drama that you are seeing across your neighbor?
I did before I started working with you and David. When I was truly an outsider, just a typical Canadian, pay attention to stuff from the UK. Oh, look, they have a monarch. They have a queen. That's cute. Now that I'm more involved with the two of you and I'm following it more closely, no, I think there's personality. It's a very British personality. That's the way I would term it. There are traditions and there's adherence to tradition that I see in not just UK leadership, but the news as it unfolds. You do things because the tradition is, and the tradition was built on sound principles, but this is the traditional way of doing it. And I think that's one of the main forms of opposition to the government that the US has elected, because Donald Trump is anything but traditional. He's something else. And that just doesn't fly as well in the UK. And I think that's one of the undercurrents. But the UK is a dynamic country with a lot of personality. I can see that as at the same time.
But Doug, do you think we're actually in a different age now? That actually that sort of stiff upper lip, that sort of measured response, that sort of key message inclusion that the Prime Minister says and then his various ministers say, that actually it comes across to voters as inauthentic and fake. And actually all of the old rules of PR, PR's heavily scripting their politicians' sort of speeches and tweets and God knows what, that actually that age is over and we just haven't got the memo. And actually the memo is what people are looking for is authenticity. They're not looking for cookie cutter, highly scripted, highly measured, sensible sounding people. They want to feel that sort of rawness of a person. They want to get a feel of that person's personality, and they want a bit of drama and they want a bit of entertainment, and they don't want sort of boring policies. I mean, if you look at, for instance, Mamdani and how he talked about sort of the affordability issue, and now our Prime Minister is now leaning into that as sort of his messaging. You've got sort of Mamdani's rhetoric was very sort of, was very entertaining and, very sort of TikToky and vibrant. And whereas sort of, our Prime Minister is also using the same messaging, but it's just not really cutting through. So my question is that do us Brits need to sort of embrace this sense of theatre? And that does seem to be doing quite well for sort of Nigel Farage, who's always been, he's always managed to cut through in terms of media, because he does come across, people do think, well, actually, he's, he sort of says it how he thinks, whether people like him or not, they do get this feel of actually he's going to be entertaining if you tune into his New Year's message versus the other politicians.
There has to be a line between sensationalism or life and character and sound, boring business as usual, right? Because I actually want sound, boring business as usual in the background with maybe a bit of humor on top of that. And finding that balance is what I would want. I think I want in a leader. At the same time, they're fighting for headlines. And the truth is, it comes down to us and our habits. And our habits are to scroll on our phones and look for us sensational clickbait and follow the clickbait, and people are trying to mislead us with false information. We're always looking for that stuff. So they're fighting in that amongst that noise, and they need to create a bigger headline to do it. And sound boring or beige seldom bursts off the screen. There's one thing you mentioned about authenticity, because I think authenticity is becoming kind of a buzz phrase today, and I'm not saying break away from authenticity, just the phraseology. I think back to Franklin Roosevelt, the US president, and the fireside chats that he started to do on the radio. That was authentic. They were partially scripted, but he had conversations with the American people and explained things in very simple terminology. I would put to you that authenticity has been around since Greek rhetoric. I think it's been around forever, and we're just coining a term these days. That's my thought. I think we're running out of time. That was David. We missed you. I hope you're back next week, and safe travels in the US. As always, thank you to our superstar producers, Emily Page and Solomon eBay. The Week Unspun is a co-production of Curzon Public Relations, Fulgate Advisors, and Stories and Strategies podcasts. You can get the recordings on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. And our final thought for today from the Persian poet Rumi.
My favorite.
Mine too. Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? Have a great weekend.